The outpost wasn't on any proper map. It sat alone in the West Texas desert, a half-rotten Confederate supply post built more out of fear than strategy. No town, no road, no river, just endless sand, dry wind, and a sky that felt too wide for human minds to carry. They called it Fort Claymore. 4 wooden towers, 1 signal platform, a rusted cannon that hadn't fired in months, and 12 soldiers who all felt the same thing but never said it out loud. This place was forgotten by the world. Private Elijah Boone arrived at Fort Claymore in the late summer of 1862. He was 19, Georgia-born, and still believed war made sense. He still believed orders had logic and maps meant safety. That belief lasted exactly 1 night. The desert around the fort was dead quiet, not peaceful, empty. No birds, no insects, no distant animal calls, just wind brushing over sand like something breathing very slowly. The men took turns on night watch. When Elijah climbed the signal tower for his first watch, he expected boredom. He expected stars. He expected silence. He did not expect the light. At 11:43 p.m., a single lantern blinked on the horizon, far away, deep in the desert. 1 flash, then darkness, then another flash, then another. Signal code. Elijah froze. His hands tightened around the rifle. No camps were supposed to be out there. No Confederate units, no Union patrol routes, no trade routes, no settlements, nothing. He called down to Sergeant Hale. "Sir, I think I'm seeing signal light." Hale climbed the tower, glass scope in hand. He watched. The light blinked again. 3 short flashes. Pause. 2 long flashes. Hale's face hardened. "That's military code." "Union?" Elijah asked. "Has to be," Hale said. By midnight, the entire fort was awake. Men lined the walls, rifles loaded. The cannon crew stood ready. The signal light continued, steady, patient, intelligent, not random, not drifting, not natural. Whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. Captain Mercer gave the order. No response, no signal back, no shots fired. They would observe. They would wait. They would not reveal their position. The desert kept answering them anyway. Hour after hour, the lantern blinked. Same patterns, same rhythm, same distance, never moving closer, never drifting away, just waiting. By dawn, the light stopped. No tracks were found. No smoke, no footprints, no signs of any camp. Nothing. Just sand. That morning, Private Boone wrote in his journal, "The desert spoke last night, and no one was there to speak for it." The officers insisted it was a Union scout using long-distance signal tactics, a psychological probe, a trick of light and distance. But the older soldiers weren't convinced. They had seen too many deserts, too many empty places, too many lands that remembered things people tried to bury. That night, the signal came again, stronger, closer, clearer, and this time it answered a signal that no one at Fort Claymore had sent. They hadn't signaled first. They hadn't answered. They hadn't revealed their position. So why was the desert communicating with them like it already knew they were there? The second night changed everything. Fort Claymore prepared as if for attack. Rifles were cleaned, ammunition counted. The signal tower was manned by 2 soldiers instead of 1. Captain Mercer ordered absolute silence protocols after sunset, not even casual talk between guards. If someone was watching from the desert, they would learn nothing from the fort. At 11:17 p.m., the lantern appeared again. Same position, same distance, same unnatural precision. The lantern blinked. 3 short flashes, 2 long, 1 short. Pause. 3 long. Sergeant Hale lifted the signal scope and began copying the pattern into his notebook. His face tightened as he translated the code. "That's not Union," he muttered. Captain Mercer stepped beside him. "What does it say?" Hale hesitated. "It doesn't match any field manual, not Confederate, not Union, not French, not Mexican trade code, not naval either." Elijah felt a cold pressure settle in his chest. "So what is it?" the captain asked. Hale swallowed. "It's structured like military code, but the syntax is wrong, the timing is wrong, the spacing is wrong. It's like someone learned signaling without learning the language." The lantern blinked again. Same pattern, same rhythm, same wrong structure. It was intelligent but unfamiliar, deliberate but foreign. Then something happened that no one at the fort could explain. The signal changed. The pattern shifted into a Confederate supply call code. An old one, outdated. A code not used since early 1861. Hale stared through the scope in disbelief. "Sir, it's using a Confederate structure now." Captain Mercer's voice hardened. "That's impossible. No one outside our lines should know that system." The lantern blinked again. Correct spacing, correct rhythm, correct structure. Perfect. Like learning something. Like something adapting. The desert wind moved through the sand in long, slow waves, making a sound that felt too close to breathing. Elijah felt it before he understood it. The signal wasn't trying to communicate with Fort Claymore. It was studying it, testing it, mirroring it, learning it. The captain finally made a decision. "Send a basic response signal," Mercer ordered. "Single pattern, minimal structure, no position data." Hale hesitated, then nodded. The Confederate lantern on the tower lit. One controlled pattern. Short, short, long. A neutral inquiry signal. The desert lantern responded instantly. No delay, no hesitation, no confusion. It answered with the exact same pattern, perfectly, like an echo, like a reflection, like a voice that had been waiting for permission to speak. Silence swallowed the fort. No man moved, no one spoke. They stared into the dark as if the desert itself had just proven it was listening. Private Boone felt a deep, irrational certainty form in his mind. Whatever was out there had not just learned their code, it had remembered it. And memories did not come from nothing. The lantern blinked again. New pattern, longer, more complex. Hale translated slowly, carefully. His hands began to shake. "It's sending coordinates," he said. Captain Mercer frowned. "Coordinates to what?" Hale's voice dropped. "To a location that isn't on any map, but matches an old military report." "What report?" Hale looked at the men around him. "The Sand Creek Massacre Site," he said quietly. "A forgotten slaughter zone, a vanished patrol camp, a classified burial ground, a place the Army officially denied ever existed. And the desert was pointing directly to it. The signal wasn't coming from a spy. It wasn't coming from a scout. It wasn't coming from an enemy camp. It was coming from a place the Army erased from history. By morning, Fort Claymore felt smaller than it ever had before. Not physically smaller, but mentally compressed, like the desert was pressing inward on it from every direction. Men spoke less. Movement felt heavier. Even the wind sounded different, lower and thicker, like it carried weight instead of air. Captain Mercer ordered a scouting patrol, not toward the signal source, toward the coordinates. 6 men were chosen. Sergeant Hale led them. Private Boone was one of them. No one protested, no one volunteered either. They rode out after sunrise, horses uneasy beneath them, hooves sinking into pale sand that looked untouched by any human path. The desert showed no tracks, no markers, no natural landmarks. It was a flat, endless emptiness that erased direction and memory at the same time. The map they carried showed nothing, blank space, but Hale followed the coordinates anyway, using instruments instead of landmarks, numbers instead of terrain. After 3 hours, the air changed. The temperature dropped, not by much, but enough to feel unnatural. Then they smelled it. Old smoke. Not fresh fire, not burning wood, not charcoal. Something deeper and heavier, like ash that had soaked into the ground and never left. The horses slowed on their own. Then they saw the land. A wide, shallow depression in the desert, shaped like a wound that never healed. The sand inside it was darker, almost gray, as if the color had been drained by time. No plants grew there. No insects moved. Even the wind seemed to avoid it. They dismounted in silence. Scattered across the ground were remnants of something that had once been human life. Rust-eaten bayonets, broken rifle stocks, bent canteens, torn fabric half buried in sand, and bones, not a few, dozens.
Half-buried skeletons tangled together, as if they had fallen where they stood and the desert had slowly tried to swallow them. Sergeant Hale removed his hat. "This is it," he said quietly. Private Boone felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't a battle. Hale shook his head. No formations, no defensive positions, no fortification remains, no trenches. He knelt beside one skeleton and brushed away sand. The skull had a bullet hole in the back. Execution style. They found more. Men shot while kneeling. Men shot while running. Men shot while trying to crawl away. This wasn't combat. It was a massacre. A patrol unit, a supply convoy, a forgotten detachment that never made it back to command. No markers, no graves, no records. Just erased men in erased land. Hale found a rusted lantern frame half buried near the center of the depression. Broken glass, warped metal. Same design as the signal lanterns used in military outposts. Private Boone felt cold creep into his hands. "Sir," he said, "what if the signal—" Hale looked at the lantern frame, then at the bones, then at the empty desert around them. "The signal isn't coming from someone," he said. "It's coming from here." They rode back in silence. No one spoke the truth out loud, but all of them felt it forming. The desert wasn't sending messages. The land was remembered. That night, Fort Claymore waited. The signal appeared again, but this time it wasn't far away. It was closer, much closer. They had found the grave. They had found the bones. They had found the truth. So why was the signal no longer coming from the distance,
But from somewhere? Moving toward the fort. No one at Fort Claymore slept that night. The patrol's discovery changed the meaning of the signal. It was no longer a mystery to solve or a threat to identify. It had become something far worse, a presence. Captain Mercer ordered double watch rotations. Lanterns were covered. No signal responses were allowed. No communication. No provocation. If the desert wanted to speak, the fort would not answer. At 10:52 p.m., the lantern appeared again. This time, it was closer. Not by a little, by a lot. What had once been a distant flicker on the horizon was now a clear, defined point of light, close enough that the men could see the metal frame shape around the flame. Sergeant Hale lifted the scope and went still. "It's moving," he said quietly. Captain Mercer stepped beside him. "In what direction?" Hale lowered the scope slowly. "Straight toward us." The lantern blinked. One flash, pause. Two flashes, pause. Three flashes. Not a signal code, a pattern, a count, a rhythm. Private Boone felt his pulse in his ears. "It's not signaling anymore," he whispered. "It's pacing." The wind shifted direction, blowing from the massacre site toward the fort. The smell of old smoke returned, heavier than before, mixed with something else, decay, dust, and something metallic that tasted like blood. The lantern blinked again, closer, brighter. Then another appeared, then another, then another. Multiple lights now dotted the desert, scattered in a wide arc, all slowly moving forward at the same speed, not marching, not charging, advancing, like a slow tide of memory. Captain Mercer ordered the cannon crew to prepare. The men obeyed, but their movements were mechanical, disconnected, like bodies obeying orders, while minds tried to understand something impossible. Sergeant Hale watched the lights through the scope. "They're not in formation," he said. "No tactical spacing, no military structure." "Then what are they doing?" Mercer asked. Hale hesitated. "They're following terrain contours, low ground, natural slopes, like water moving downhill." The lanterns continued their approach. The fort's walls felt suddenly thin. Wood against desert, human construction against something older. Private Boone felt a crushing certainty settle into him. This wasn't an attack force, it was a return. The lanterns stopped. They formed a wide half-circle around Fort Claymore, just beyond rifle range. Silent, still, waiting. No shots fired, no voices, no movement, just light in the dark. Then the central lantern blinked. Signal pattern. Hale translated slowly. "It's using the old Confederate distress code," he said. "What does it say?" Mercer asked. Hale swallowed. "It's not asking for help." "Then what is it doing?" Hale looked at the men around him. "It's reporting in." Silence crushed the platform. Reporting in to what command? To what officer? To what structure? To what memory? The lantern blinked again. New pattern. Clear. Deliberate. Hale translated out loud. "Unit status. Present. Casualties. Remembered. Orders. Return." Private Boone felt his legs weaken. The desert wasn't communicating. It was reenacting, replaying, executing a memory loop carved into the land itself, and Fort Claymore was now part of that memory. The lights were not surrounding the fort. They were not preparing to attack. They were not trying to communicate. They were waiting for the fort to respond to orders that no living officer had ever given. The lanterns remained fixed around Fort Claymore, forming a wide, silent boundary that no one inside the fort could explain or understand. They did not move closer, but they did not withdraw either. Their stillness was worse than motion because it felt deliberate, as if the desert itself had drawn a line and was waiting to see who would cross it. Captain Mercer ordered every man to hold position. No firing, no signaling, no provocation. The men obeyed, but fear moved through the fort like an infection. Hands shook on rifles, eyes stayed locked on the glowing lights in the sand. No one trusted the darkness anymore. Near midnight, the central lantern blinked again and sent a structured signal. Sergeant Hale translated slowly, his voice tense and controlled. "It's requesting command acknowledgement," he said. Mercer stared at the desert. "We are not responding." The signal repeated. Then it repeated again. The pattern was patient, consistent, and mechanical, like a system that expected compliance rather than negotiation. It did not behave like a human signaler. It behaved like a process. Then something happened that shattered the last sense of control inside the fort. The Confederate signal lantern on the tower ignited. No soldier touched it, no officer ordered it, no one stood near it. The flame rose inside the glass and began blinking in structured code. Private Boone felt his chest tighten. He did not feel fear anymore. He felt certainty, and certainty was worse. Sergeant Hale began translating the outgoing signal, his voice barely steady. "It's transmitting command authorization, unit verification, return directive confirmation." Captain Mercer shook his head in disbelief. The fort is responding. And that was the truth. Not the men, not the officers, not the soldiers. The structure itself was communicating. The ropes, the fittings, the lantern system, the signal platform had become part of the memory loop embedded in the land. The desert lanterns responded in unison. Acknowledgement received. Then they began to move, not in a charge, not in formation, not with military discipline. They advanced the way fog moves, the way tidewater rises, slow and unstoppable. Mercer ordered a cannon warning shot. The blast thundered across the desert and shook the fort's walls, but the lanterns did not react. They did not scatter, they did not slow, they did not change direction. They continued forward. The air changed. The smell of ash returned, stronger and heavier, mixed with decay and old smoke. The temperature dropped sharply. The lantern flames shifted color, burning with an unnatural blue tone that did not behave like real fire. Then the sounds began. Not voices in the normal sense, but layered impressions of pain, fear, panic, and commands, overlapping as if time itself was bleeding through the air. The massacre site was no longer a location in the desert. It had become an active memory field. Private Boone fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of it. This was not an invasion. This was not an attack. This was not a haunting. It was a memory cycle completing itself. The land had recorded a massacre, and now it was replaying it through the fort. Fort Claymore was no longer a military outpost. It was part of the memory. The lanterns were no longer outside the fort. The memory was no longer in the desert. And the past was no longer staying in the past. Because the next signal would not come from the sand, it would come from inside Fort Claymore itself. Fort Claymore was no longer functioning as a fort. It still had walls, towers, rifles, and men in uniform, but its purpose had changed. The structure felt hollow, like a shell that something else had moved into. The desert no longer surrounded it. The desert occupied it. The lantern on the tower continued blinking without human control. Sergeant Hale stood beside it, translating the code in a low, controlled voice, while Captain Mercer listened in silence. The message repeated itself in structured cycles, each one more detailed than the last. It was no longer sending commands. It was issuing orders. The code described unit movements, supply positioning, defensive placement, and formation structures that did not match modern Confederate doctrine. They matched older patterns, outdated systems used in early frontier warfare, long before Fort Claymore even existed. "This is pre-war structure," Hale said quietly. "Old frontier military doctrine, patrol-era formations." Captain Mercer felt a chill move through him. "Those are the patterns from the massacre site." Hale nodded. "The fort is now following the Memory's command system." Private Boone watched soldiers around him unconsciously adjust their stances, spacing, and positions in ways that mirrored the coded instructions. No one had ordered them to move. No one had told them to reposition, yet their bodies were responding to something they could not hear, but somehow understood. The Memory was not controlling the men directly. It was influencing the space they occupied. The walls, the platforms, the towers, the walkways. The architecture itself had become a command interface. The lanterns outside continued their slow advance until they reached the outer perimeter of the fort. They stopped just beyond the walls, not attempting to enter, but maintaining presence. Their light illuminated the wood and iron structures, bathing them in a pale, unnatural glow that made the fort look older, darker, and wrong. Captain Mercer ordered the men into defensive formation. They complied, but Hale noticed something disturbing. "They're forming according to the Memory pattern, not your command structure." Mercer realized the truth in that moment. The fort was no longer operating under human authority. The men believed they were following orders, but their positions were aligning with the massacre formation logic, not Confederate military strategy. The Memory was shaping behavior without words, without force, without direct control. It was guiding. The signal lantern blinked again. New code. Hale translated carefully. "It's issuing a return order." "Return to where?" Mercer asked. Hale hesitated. "To the massacre site. Full unit movement. March protocol." Private Boone felt his stomach drop. "It's trying to take us back there." The land was not trying to attack Fort Claymore. It was trying to complete a historical loop. The massacre unit had never returned, so the Memory was trying to bring a unit back to finish the cycle. The lanterns outside the walls began shifting position, forming a corridor of light that pointed directly toward the coordinates of the massacre site. It was not a path of attack. It was a path of guidance, a route, an invitation, a command road. Captain Mercer understood the horror of it. If the fort followed the signal, the unit would march into the desert and disappear into the same memory trap that consumed the first patrol. The land would not kill them violently. It would absorb them, replace the old bones with new ones, preserve the memory with fresh bodies. Fort Claymore was not being destroyed, it was being recruited. The desert was no longer trying to surround the fort. The memory was no longer trying to communicate. The land was now issuing marching orders. And if Fort Claymore followed the signal, there would be no survivors left to remember what happened. Captain Mercer knew that once the first step was taken, there would be no turning back. The lantern corridor outside the fort stretched across the desert like a silent road, its pale light forming a clear path toward the massacre site. It did not look threatening. It did not feel aggressive. That made it worse. It felt organized, purposeful, and calm, like a plan that had already been executed once and was now simply being repeated. Inside Fort Claymore, the men stood in formation without fully understanding why they had arranged themselves that way. Their bodies obeyed patterns that felt natural, but their minds could not explain the logic. Sergeant Hale watched their alignment and recognized the structure immediately. It matched the old patrol formations recorded in pre-war military doctrine, the same formations documented in the erased massacre report. "This isn't fear movement," Hale said quietly to Mercer. "This is guided movement. The memory is not forcing them, it's shaping their decisions." Private Boone felt the pull in his chest, a strange internal pressure that made the lantern path feel familiar, almost safe. The idea terrified him more than the lights themselves.
He realized the memory was not acting like an enemy. It was acting like a mission order. Captain Mercer climbed the signal platform and shut down the lantern manually. The flame died, and the blinking stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the desert lanterns continued blinking on their own. The memory did not need the fort system anymore. The path of light remained. The land was now self-sustaining the command structure. Mercer gathered the men in the central yard. He spoke clearly, firmly, and slowly, grounding his voice in authority and human presence. "No one moves. No one follows the lights. No one steps beyond the perimeter. These are not orders. These are not signals. This is not a mission. This is a psychological phenomenon tied to terrain memory." The men listened, but Boone could see the conflict in their faces. Logic was fighting instinct. Command was fighting influence. Training was fighting something deeper and older. Then one soldier stepped forward. Private Carter. Young, quiet, devout, known for never disobeying orders. He did not look afraid. He looked calm. "I hear the command," Carter said. Mercer turned sharply. "There is no command." Carter shook his head slowly. "There is. It's not a voice, sir. It's a direction. It feels like marching orders." Before anyone could stop him, Carter walked toward the gate. 2 soldiers grabbed him, but he fought with a strength that did not feel like panic. It felt like determination. "They're waiting," he said. "We're late." Hale felt a chill move through him. The memory isn't controlling everyone at once. It's activating individuals. The lantern corridor brightened. The energy intensified. The land responded to Carter's movement. More soldiers began to shift uneasily, not moving, not marching, but turning, looking, orienting themselves toward the light. The memory was no longer commanding the fort. It was selecting the unit, one body at a time. Captain Mercer understood the danger. If even one man crossed that line and followed the path, the memory loop would strengthen. The land would gain confirmation. The cycle would lock in. This was not about survival anymore. It was about containment. Because once the march began, it would not stop at one man. The desert did not need the fort anymore. The memory did not need the structure. The land had started choosing its soldiers, and the next one it chose would not be the last. The first man crossed the line at 2:14 a.m. It was not Private Carter. It was Corporal Jennings. He had been standing near the eastern wall, quiet and still, watching the lantern corridor without speaking. No one noticed him move at first. There was no panic in his expression, no fear in his posture, no urgency in his steps. He walked with the calm confidence of a man following a familiar route. Private Boone saw it happen and shouted his name. "Jennings!" The sound broke the silence, but it did not stop him. Jennings reached the gate, placed his hand on the iron latch, and opened it. Captain Mercer ran forward. "Stop him!"
two soldiers grabbed Jennings by the arms, but he did not resist in panic. He did not struggle wildly. He simply pushed forward with steady strength, like someone trying to walk against a strong current. His face was calm, almost peaceful. "You don't understand," Jennings said quietly. "We're not being taken. We're being returned." Those words sent a cold wave through the yard. The lantern corridor brightened instantly, as if the land itself had responded to his intent.
Then another man turned, then another. Not rushing, not panicking, not running. They simply reoriented their bodies toward the light. Sergeant Hale watched in horror as the pattern emerged. "It's not possession," he said. "It's alignment. The memory is syncing with them." Captain Mercer felt his authority slipping away, not through rebellion, but through influence. The men were not disobeying him. They were responding to something older than command structures and military law. Private Boone felt the pull himself now. It was not a voice. It was not a sound. It was a direction embedded in his thoughts, like a compass turning inside his mind. The lantern path did not feel threatening. It felt inevitable. Hale grabbed Boone's arm. "Focus on me," he said firmly. "Do not look at the lights. Do not follow the path. Do not let the land decide for you." Jennings broke free. He stepped through the gate. The moment his foot touched the desert sand, the lantern corridor surged brighter, and the other lanterns outside shifted position to widen the path. The memory had been confirmed. The cycle had been accepted. Captain Mercer ordered the gate sealed, but it was already too late. Two more men moved toward it, then three, not together, not as a group, individually, selected, drawn, chosen. The memory was no longer trying to move the fort. It was harvesting the unit, one soldier at a time. Private Boone felt tears fill his eyes. "Where are they going?" Hale answered with quiet certainty. "They're not going somewhere. They're becoming part of something." Jennings walked down the lantern path without looking back. His silhouette faded into the pale glow as the desert swallowed him. Then another man followed. Then another. The fort watched in silence as living soldiers stepped into a dead memory. No gunfire, no resistance, no screams, only footsteps fading into light. The massacre site was no longer a grave. It was becoming a destination again. The land had begun collecting replacements. The memory had found new bodies to carry it forward. The past was rebuilding itself with the living, and the final signal was no longer calling soldiers outward. It was calling the fort itself to collapse inward. By dawn, Fort Claymore no longer felt like a military outpost. It felt like a hollow shell that something ancient had already emptied from the inside. The lantern corridor still burned in the desert, but fewer soldiers remained inside the walls to witness it. The men who had followed the light were gone, swallowed by the pale glow and the endless sand. No tracks led back, no shadows returned, no movement came from the massacre site. The desert had taken them quietly, without violence, without struggle, without resistance. Captain Mercer stood on the signal platform as the sun rose, his face hollow with exhaustion and disbelief. Sergeant Hale stood beside him, watching the desert with eyes that no longer searched for meaning. Private Boone sat against the wall, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the gate where men had walked out and never returned. The signal lantern on the tower blinked one final time. Not a command, not a directive, not a pattern. A closure sequence. Hale translated it slowly. Unit cycle complete. Memory preserved. Return acknowledged. Then the lantern went dark. The desert lanterns faded one by one, their blue flames dissolving into ordinary sunlight. The air warmed. The ash smell disappeared. The unnatural cold lifted. The memory field collapsed back into silence. It was over. Not defeated, not destroyed, completed. Fort Claymore survived, but it was no longer operational. Half the unit was gone. Communication systems failed. Horses refused to leave the perimeter. Supply lines never returned. Within weeks, the outpost was officially abandoned, labeled as structurally unstable and strategically unnecessary. No report ever mentioned the lanterns. No military record listed the missing soldiers. No documents referenced the massacre site. Fort Claymore simply vanished from official history. Years later, travelers in West Texas spoke of strange lights in the desert at night. Old ranchers told stories of a place where the land remembered men who died without graves. Signal flashed.
Private Boone survived the war. He never returned to the desert. But in his journal, he wrote one final entry about Fort Claymore. The land does not forget. It does not forgive. And it does not need ghosts to remember violence. Sometimes memory becomes the living thing. Because Fort Claymore was not destroyed. It was absorbed. The desert did not haunt it. The desert answered it. And somewhere in the empty spaces of West Texas, the memory still waits for the next structure, the next unit, the next place that listens when the land decides to speak. If stories like this one pulled you into the darkness, if you felt the silence, the isolation, and the horror of memory trapped in land, then you are already part of what Canon of Darkness is building. This channel is not about cheap scares. It is not about fast horror. It is about deep psychological storytelling, historical darkness, and slow-burn fear that stays in your mind long after the story ends. Subscribe to Canon of Darkness for cinematic horror stories, dark American history, isolation narratives, and true-style psychological storytelling that turns memory into terror. Because some places don't need ghosts. They only need to remember.